There we are, we're now recording. So I'd like to start this session with an acknowledgement of country, acknowledging that we're all on First Nations land. For me, and I expect for many of us, we're on the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And as traditional owners, they have never ceded sovereignty over this land. I'd like to acknowledge and express my gratitude for the care that Indigenous peoples have given to this land over many, many, many generations, and also the destruction and damage that's been done to that land and to the First Nations peoples since colonisation. I'd also acknowledge their resilience in despite that, and also the special significance that the climate crisis has for all Indigenous people. So on behalf of DCAN, I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, and note that DCAN commits to working alongside First Nations people as we chart a shared path towards a sustainable future. Let me just give you a little bit of background about DCAN, Darebin Climate Action Now, and how we happen to be working with the Metropolitan Community Power Hub. So we're a community group that is made up of local residents campaigning for a safe climate. We've been operating for over 13 years, basically raising community awareness in Darebin and further afield about the urgent need to act on the climate emergency. So we've done this through information sessions, through showing films, setting up petitions, writing submissions, putting up murals around the community, musical events. And we engage both with our local council, but also with state and federal politicians, as well as other local community groups. So you could say we use every avenue that is open to us to alert residents and to encourage them and our government to take the action that's so desperately needed. So most recently, we've become a partner with the Metro Community Power Hub, which is led by the Yarra Energy Foundation. And together with all of our partners, there are a number of partners of local climate groups and councils, we are wanting to provide community members with information and resources about the ways they can both reduce their emissions and at the same time reduce their energy bills through shifting to renewable energy. So that's what tonight is all about.
Already missed the deadline. Another half an hour.
She said she's going to get in by 6 p.m.
There we are. So let me introduce our guest speakers for tonight, Peter Mercouriou and Tim Shue, both from the Metropolitan Community Power Hub and the Yarra Energy Foundation. We will have a Q&A session at the end of their two presentations, which will be facilitated by Lisa Clausen, who is also from the hub. And so if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll come to them. Some will be answered in text as we go along, if they're easy ones to answer, and others will have answers from Peter and Tim. So introducing Peter then. Peter has more than 10 years of experience in the energy and energy efficiency sector. He's had an interesting history. He's previously worked on a no-waste fruit delivery business in the United States, and also been involved in conservation work in South Africa. But he describes his bread and butter being energy audits, energy policy, energy analysis, all things solar and energy efficiency. So his passion is in ensuring that no one is left behind in the energy transition that we know we must have if we're wanting a safe climate for our kids and our grandkids. So every day he helps people and companies to lower their bills and to transition to better energy. Let me also introduce Tim now, who will speak after Peter, just to help with the flow of tonight. So Tim is the Manager of Communications and Marketing for the Hub, and he has worked at the intersection of local governments, climate change and communication strategy. He believes in empowering people to live more sustainably and mindfully, following principles of dignity and dialogue, and within the context of the global limits, planetary limits. He's worked as a communications specialist for national and international not-for-profits, and he enjoys working with groups to bridge the gap between research on one side and practice on the other. So these are our two very experienced presenters that we're going to have tonight, and I'd now like to hand over to Peter to kick us off.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks very much for the warm welcome and the investigatory work of learning more about my fruit business that I had in Portland, Oregon. Perhaps that's on LinkedIn somewhere. I'm not sure. It's not running. It did exist for 7 years, but it's another story altogether. So everyone, I just want to say a warm welcome. Thank you very much for attending one of the first webinars that we've held as the Metro Community Power Hub. And a lot of what you come here tonight is to learn a bit about what Tim's going to talk about, which is community batteries, which feeds into kind of what I'm talking about as well, which is your all-electric home. So we'd like to, I'll share some slides with you and talk about the Yarra Energy Foundation just very briefly, because in my experience, not a lot of people know much about the Yarra Energy Foundation. I have been with the Yarra Energy Foundation now for, well, 5 years. And I do love it. And the reason why I do love it is because my father grew up in Collingwood. I grew up in Thornbury. So there's a real connection there. So my thrill is working with the people around our areas to really build them up. And energy becomes such a topical area, particularly for low income and for generally all of us. So can everyone, I can't really get rid of that at the moment, the bottom thing, if you can see that, but never mind. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So the Yarra Energy Foundation, for those of you that do not know, it is funded by the City of Yarra primarily. And what we do is we try to engage with people to inspire a zero carbon future, basically. And we want to connect with people to build that. And part of what we do is really engaging with the heart of what climate change is all about. And for us, it's climate change response. So we do work with a lot of businesses and households to improve energy efficiency through assessments. We also work with households to install solar PV. We've run a lot of programs, not just in Yarra, but right across the breadth of Victoria. Through those programs, we've managed to install about 3 megawatts of solar, engaging with about 1,000 households in the process as well. So since 2018. So we've done a lot of work in that area, which has really helped us drive the Metro Community Power Hub and launch it as a shovel-ready kind of concept from the get-go. Personally, I've helped with about 400 public housing residents. It's a really huge area for me. And those 400 vulnerable residents of ours, I was helping them with their bills. And generally speaking, they're paying 10 cents or 20 cents more than what we have been. So the Metro Community Power Hub actually offers a really good vehicle to try and change that. And I'll explain more about that later. So the all-electric home, I'm sure we have some ideas of what that looks like. Renew have done some great work in this area, as has a lot of similar groups as well. So what I'm going to talk about with the all-electric home is going back to the future. So you may or may not know, but back in the late 50s, in America particularly, that this was a real thing. Changing all your appliances to electric was happening. And guess what? We're doing it again. The difference, of course, well, maybe not, of course, is that this was all powered by nuclear energy, which we probably want to maybe move away from if we're on it at the moment, like lots of Europe or America, for that example. And we are replacing that with, obviously, wind and solar. So it's pretty impressive. I'm not sure if anyone's read, there was a great report and some research done by Renew, which is the former ATA, back in 2018, that suggested if you had a 5 kilowatt solar PV system over 10 years, even in Melbourne, you'd be better off in the order of $9,000 to $18,000 by getting off gas and moving to an all-electric home with solar PV. So pretty exciting times we're living in, because these solutions are available to us today. And to be quite honest, for some of us, it is affordable. For some of us, it is not. And we're very conscious of that. And we're trying to work out how to make sure that we've got equity when we do this transition. That's one of the larger goals we strive for when we speak with government bodies, which we do pretty regularly. So what is an all-electric home? Well, pretty basic. It's what we're talking about here, the products or things you can do around the home, which are the building blocks of an all-electric home. I wouldn't consider doing it all at once if you're not able to. it can be a step-by-step process. So what we are looking at is energy efficiency. You got to have that thermal shell. You got to have insulation. You got to have draft proofing. It's really difficult to have insulation and draft proofing not there and having all the other things, because we're not really concentrating on the bigger picture. Insulation in the ceiling is really, really important. Obviously, that's a bit easier to do in some respects. In the wall, not so easy. But there is blown insulation that is available to us. If you really want to go the full ball, you can take out your drywall, your plaster. It's about 50 meters per square meter, roughly. But then we're also talking about solar PV and battery. We're also talking about heat pump hot water, reverse cycle, split systems for your heating and cooling, and induction cooktops. Moving quite along. So just very, very simple. When the sun is shining and your solar panels are there operating and generating power from that sunlight, it converts it into DC or direct current electricity. That then is moved across into your inverter, which converts that electricity into alternating current for use in your home, of which all the appliances in our home use, which is great. So that's very, 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 I find it to be very, very simple. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated in creating that inverter itself. But obviously, we want to know that when the sun is shining, you're producing a bit of energy to power your appliances. So whatever you can shift to those times really optimizes that system. So what I mean by that is using your clothes washer, dishwasher, setting timers for those things if you can't be at home. That's what you're looking at. If you have a split system, perhaps you can set a timer for that from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. For when you get home, if you've been out and about, that's the way to go. So any excess solar typically gets exported to the grid. About 10 years ago, the rate was about 70 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, I believe it to be about 5.7 or 6. It kind of changes pretty regularly, with a lot of talk about that being removed entirely. So a battery is a decent option in that respect. Or if you're thinking really far into the future, an electric vehicle. That storage in an electric vehicle with bi-directional flows might be the solution for you, and maybe not for some others. So really, these solutions that we're talking about can be tailored, and that's really important to know. So what I'm talking about here is quite general. For your specific circumstances, we can have a conversation. Me and the team at Yarra Energy Foundation, and by large, the Metro Community Power Hub is here to help you with your own journey in that respect. So heat pump hot water, has everyone heard about that? I'm pretty sure we have. We've got 2 systems here. One on the left and one on the right. The one on the left is your kind of integrated system. The benefits of that is it's a kind of a simpler install, compact. So if you got not as much space at some of the houses that you might find in Collingwood, for example, if you've got some space in Northcote, you might want to choose the option on the right, which is your split system unit. Basically, it allows greater flexibility where you can have those 2 components in separate areas. But with our preferred panel supply list, we'll be able to navigate what the right solution is for you. So simply, a heat pump works similarly to a refrigerator in that it extracts heat from the surrounding air. Well, it's the refrigeration cycle, to be fair. Extracts heat from the surrounding air, then uses a heat exchanger to heat water in that insulated tank, which is really helpful in terms of cutting down your costs. The reason for that is if you time it correctly, that hot water that is now hot water because you've flicked the switch and the sunshine is shining, and that is generating that solar system into your hot water heat pump. That hot water can actually be stored for 24 to 48 hours. In that way, it acts kind of like a thermal battery. So if you were considering a battery for energy use, you might want to go to a hot water heat pump first. The reason for that is it does basically cost about 30 to 40% of household energy consumption and spend over the course of a year. So it's a pretty clever way to capture that energy and store it for later use. And you can time it. If you don't have solar PV and you were thinking about getting a heat pump, if you were to change your electricity plan, your retail plan, to have peak and off-peak rates, you could time that heat pump to work in your off-peak areas, usually overnight, where it's a bit cheaper to use electricity because the demand isn't there. Without a booster, you don't really need a booster with these guys. You're probably saving around the $300 mark. Again, that number changes depending on your system. One of the advantages of a heat pump hot water unit over, say, your solar hot water system is the lower piping costs. The maintenance is much less as well. At the same time, you can take advantage of the off-peak rates, like I was just explaining, where with solar hot water, you can't really do those things. And as well with solar PV, that really minimizes the costs as well. To give you an idea, and again, this is quite general, at your optimum. So all these, this is taken directly from Sustainability Victoria, and it is general for that reason, because Sustainability Victoria is covering the entire state. But they're kind of these top of the range: gas storage, gas instantaneous, electric storage, and you got your solar gas boosted there, which I'll talk about in a second, and the solar electric boosted as well. But they're all kind of like your high end in terms of energy efficiency or of these products. That's where that sits. So your heat pump, without including solar PV, but is on an off-peak tariff or rate, you can tell that it's really, really efficient and doesn't cost that much to run over the year. So if you did have solar PV and that was funneling all that generation into that heat pump for storage, you'd be saving more than that $185 you see there, which is great. I know I'm probably speaking quickly. That's because we've got a lot to get through, but that's all right. If you have questions, I'll answer it towards the end. A lot of questions I've been getting recently, and this has probably only been happening in the past 6 months, I'd say, is that a lot of people have hydronic heating and underfloor or wall panels with that hydronic heating attached to a boiler. There are electric boilers on the market. They can be expensive. They are coming through the pipeline. They're a lot more popular in the UK. I've got to hand it to hydronic heating. If you've got it, the warmth and comfort from hydronic heating is appealing. It is the best without doubt. And you can actually transition your boiler to a heat pump. I would recommend thinking about it when your boiler is about 10 to 15 years of age. That's when you can start planning for the heat pump, start saving for a heat pump. Because some instances you might need 2 heat pumps for water and for your boiler specifically. The only difference with the boiler, it tends to have a boiling temperature of around, I think it's around 85 degrees. But with the heat pumps, we really want to get it down to about 55. So because of that, you have a slower response time for your heating demands. So the heat pump is probably working for longer. That is where you're having solar PV, for example, and a fairly large array, probably a 5 to 6 kilowatt range, is really going to be super helpful. One of the things, I'm renovating my house down in Geelong West at the moment, and one of the things I found super useful in that, well, not only because I know what, well, I'd like to think I know what I'm talking about, but ceiling fans can be really useful in circulating warm air. So that is something that you might want to look into. The fans themselves aren't expensive. The installation is a pain in the butt. That can get up there. But I think I spent overall for three fans about $300 each. And the install, I did a bit of it. So it was about $200. So you're looking, that was for 3, so $1,000. You also really want to pay attention to the access on the sides of your homes. Do you have enough space for heat pumps? They're a lot larger than your boilers. They're quite compact boilers. That's what I appreciate them, to be fair. But yes, that is got to factor into your considerations as well. Moving on to reverse cycle split systems. So you might have just those units, maybe particularly in the new apartments, you have them in the living rooms, but you may not know the size that's adequate for your needs. So there's a bit of a rundown there in the central column there of what suits the size, what suits what size rooms. So the single split system is pretty common in open plan living, particularly for kind of your larger, so you're looking at like the 7 to 9.5 kilowatt range for kind of your larger homes. My house is quite small. It's around 170 square meters, the house itself. And I have a small open area, and I'm looking at probably a 6 kilowatt just to make sure that that's adequate. You can also have what's known as multi-head systems with your split system. What that means is you can actually get 5 indoor units to your 1 outdoor unit. The only issue with that is you need to have roof space in your the cavity in your roof to allow for the piping. So there is an additional cost to that. And I looked into doing that for my house, and only to 2 bedrooms and for 3 units. And that was looking at about 10 to 15 grand spend, as opposed to putting in a 2.5 kilowatt system in each bedroom. Granted, I'd have to put those outdoor units somewhere. My space is limited, but that would be a $3,000 spend instead of, $10,000 to $15,000 spend. So these are the sorts of things you got to really think through. And if you need more advice, obviously come through to us at the Yarra Energy Foundation. We can certainly help you out there. There's still a lot of gas ducted systems out there. You can change that across to a split system as well. The only issue with that is you got to check your ductwork, make sure there's no leaks in that ductwork. It's really hard to get, if it's underfloor, really hard to get access to that space in some houses. So you might have to replace that whole ducting, and that again increases the cost of changing or swapping over your system from that gas unit. So there's something to pay attention to. Another thing that's really come up quite a lot recently, which is all very good things, is induction cooktops. My colleague Lachlan pointed out that I should pop in the non-stick aluminum, not suitable for updating pots and pans, well, not suitable for induction cooktops. He also mentioned, which I didn't realize, you can do the magnet test. If the magnet sticks to the pan, you should be okay. If it doesn't, you need to get new pans. And I've been looking at pans and they are really expensive. But I keep saying it's really expensive. There is a cost involved, but there's also a huge amount of savings involved. Going back to the Renew report, that took into account all of these costs that I'm talking about, which is why then I go back to, it's a step-by-step process. So really think about it. The upgrade to the switchboard, a lot of switchboards these days are upgraded, but the induction cooktop will need a dedicated circuit, as will your hot water heat pump. So that can vary in terms of costs to upgrade your switchboard from $800 to $1,000. Through the Metro Community Power Hub, it's allowed me some time to really focus on how do we make it simple? Because if you've got a gas stove and potentially a gas oven as well, and you're wanting to switch to electric, you're going to need an electrician and a gas fitter, and just the call out fees for them is extraordinary. So fortunately, through the pool that we have and the leverage that we have through the Metro Community Power Hub, I've got a really good list of both electrician and gas fitter in one. So we're planning an induction cooktop preparedness program where we can take care of the cost of preparing you for induction and moving forward that way, which is awesome. So the Metro Community Power Hub, it's a bit of a coup for us, to be perfectly honest. Now, these power hubs, you may know, may not know, did start off regionally back in 2018 in Bendigo, Ballarat and Latrobe Valley. We had the pleasure of working with the Latrobe Valley Community Power Hub, and through the pilot phase of 2018 to 2020, they decided to launch them to 3 more locations. And the Yarra Energy Foundation is the lead partner of the Metro Community Power Hub. And one of the great things about that is we can actually bring a lot of groups together who would have potentially been working in silos, all doing the same great work, but now we can amplify their message across a broader audience, which is what I'm really excited about. One of the key things in the Metro Power Hub is being able to deliver shovel-ready projects. So all the things I just talked about getting your home all electric, that's what our programs are all geared towards. And I'll come back to how we do that in just a moment. So the very important aspect of this is how do we work collaboratively? So the idea is to develop and deliver a huge pipeline of socially acceptable, financially feasible, technically viable projects. Fortunately for Yarra Energy Foundation, we bring a lot of expertise and nous to the role, and our job is to basically train all of our climate community groups like DCAN in that. And so they know what to talk about confidently. And that is an ongoing process over the next 8 months. We're really wanting to get everyone to a level where we're all confident in talking about transitioning to an all-electric home and really pinpointing areas and gaps where government may not, state government or federal government, which is, that's something in itself, aren't able to fill. And that's where the grassroots organisation of a DCAN and a EF to that extent to really drive that home. And Yarra Energy Foundation, as a not-for-profit independent group, we can really offer that local trusted advice to the community on clean energy solutions and deliver those implementation-ready community energy projects. So I'm really stoked to work with DCAN moving forward because they're not the only group. We've also got the Bayside Climate Crisis Action Group attached to the Metro Community Power Hub. GCAN, can anyone guess what that is? That is Glen Ira Climate Action Network. The Jewish Climate Network has joined. Very excited to work with them. Port Phillip Emergency Climate Action Network. Port Phillip Emergency Climate Action Network, also part of a larger network of climate-related groups, as is DCAN for that matter. So again, this is about all these groups sharing information, building the right way of connecting into MPs, writing letters, advocating for faster, further change in the climate change response area. Lighter footprints, that's Burundara. Bungar area. They've been fantastic and very active for quite some time. Have the ear of our federal treasurer, I believe, and there's Darebin naturally. YCAN stands for Yarra Climate Action Now. I used to say network a lot, got me in trouble quite a few times. SEAM, which is actually a social enterprise, has a lot of affiliation with the Catholic Archdiocese, which is great. So between the Jewish Climate Network and the Catholic Archdiocese, we're going to do some great things in the religious and faith areas. We're bringing in a few groups from the Sikh community too, and the Muslim community. It's all in the works with this Metro Community Power Hub. So hopefully we'll find peace across the world through the Metro Community Power Hub. And of course, we've got the Yarra Energy Foundation. So the foundation projects through the Metro Community Power Hub, we've got two streams. We've got foundation, we've got flagship. So I'll go to flagship a bit later, but the foundational projects really go towards our all-electric homes, the solar PV, split systems, hot water heat pumps, and induction preparedness, as well as energy literacy. What that means is understanding your bill. There's 25 retailers out there in the market, and our job is to help coal communities handle that. That in itself is a larger project where DCAN and YCAN had a great workshop, and we're looking to run further workshops in libraries and neighbourhood houses all across the area for coal communities and as well as pensioners as well. So the all-electric program, like I said, pretty much includes all of the above, which I've spoken about. What I really want to really push home tonight to make sure everyone's very, very okay with this is that we do a very comprehensive and rigorous due diligence process. The reason for that is there's so many solar suppliers and just suppliers in general out there in the market. Who do you choose? Who's the right person to go through? Who's not going to shake your money out of your wallet? And that's part of our due diligence process. We have well over 60 points of criteria that these commercial partners that we bring on as our preferred panel list have to go through. You may have heard of the Clean Energy Council, which acts as a bit of a guiding post for some of those solar companies. And we go to one extra level when it comes to solar and all the other products that are available through the Metro Community Power Hub. Really want to have this home because we wouldn't be able to get to the position we are as the Yarra Energy Foundation without this process. It really does de-risk programs like this for councils and also state government. It's a really important aspect. So once the preferred supplier, commercial supplier, is a part of our preferred panel list, they understand and they're aware that they're a part of a community-led program. And that's really important. So they're not pushy, they're not salespeople. They're there to help you find the right solution for you. We also negotiate about 20% off solar system price. Unfortunately, I won't be able to do that for the other products because there's just not enough margin for our groups, and I don't want to increase any costs to anyone. So, but for solar systems, there's room to lower that rate for everybody if you go through our solar program, part of the Metro Community Power Hub. Naturally, going back to that due diligence process, we wouldn't have been able to achieve as many solar programs that we have with our council partners. It's about 10 that we've done in the past 3 years. I've got 2.5 megawatts there, but I checked the other day, we're clearing about 3 megawatts now with well over 1,100 participating households and more than 3,000 people requesting quotes for different products, which is great. So I did mention this before, just the energy literacy. Take a look at your retail offer plan that you're on right now. We're looking to put together a 100% green power option. We're in the moment discussing that with retailers, providing a product that's simple and easy to understand. It's really hard to understand, but yeah, it's an important part of the mix. And one of the best parts I found while working at the Yarra Energy Foundation is really getting a grasp and understanding of new products that are entering the market, but also having that leverage that we've got with the community behind us to tell retailers that they're not doing a good enough job, and this is what we're really looking for. Which is really important. So moving on to the flagship projects. This is for everybody in the audience tonight. Aim high, think big, whatever you think might be a good idea for a crazy climate change response program and solution, please reach out to us, come to us. It might be a huge solar PV system, might be a scoping feasibility study for community batteries, which Tim will go into a little bit later on. It might be a power purchase agreement for households, a large industrial. I'm trying to organise a power purchase agreement for public housing residents as they're all on individual retailers and getting a bad deal. That's something that we're incorporating into the Metro Community Power Hub. Also looking at the virtual energy network and how we can drive change in that space. So that's one of the areas I'm really excited to concentrate on throughout the Metro Community Power Hub cycle, as well as transitioning a whole retail street. Like, for example, imagine all the shops on High Street Northcote switching to a 100% renewable energy offering. Now, if you want to help us do that, head off and talk to Anne, because we'd really use all the help getting the message and the word out there. Now, when I say 100% renewable energy offer, it's got to be competitive. I do not want businesses having to pay more for renewable power when they don't have to necessarily. And that's where we come involved. We kind of negotiate all that. So a bit of a call to action before I move to Tim. Tim, sorry if I'm going over time. If you want a free no obligation quote from our preferred panel of suppliers, head to that website, yef.org.au/MCPH. In a couple of weeks, we'll have a standalone Metro Community Power Hub website. We've got about 10 or 12. There's more community groups joining us as of tonight. I've got a meeting with the Mornington group after this, which is awesome. And we've got more and more councils stepping in and wanting to participate in the Metro Community Power Hub too. So we're looking at about 26 key stakeholders with this Metro Community Power Hub project, which is amazing. Like I said earlier, consider renewable electric home as a step-by-step process. We do have 30 minutes doing a huge renovation. Through the hub, we've been able to work with Renew to have 30-minute energy consultations. Myself can also do that, as well as Lachlan. Love to talk to you. Hit me up at information@yef.org.au for that. And to become part of Darebin Climate Action Now, because it's very important, they've been going on for such a great period of time. Join them and be a part of the Metro Community Power Hub. And that's all from me. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Pete. And thank you, Anne and DCAN, for having us. It's wonderful to see so many people here. If you just give me a second, I will share my screen. Do that again. All right, just confirming you can see the slideshow. Yep, fantastic. All right, so I am going to give you a bit of insight into one of the most exciting projects I've come across, and that is on community batteries. So this is one of the Yarra Energy Foundation's key projects, and we hope that we'll be able to share as much information through the Metro Community Power Hub on this project. So it's absolutely my pleasure to be able to talk to this. I'm the community engagement lead for this project. If you have any technical questions on community batteries, very happy to take them and refer them to our community battery project manager as well. And as Pete mentioned, our role at the Yarra Energy Foundation is to help communities access more renewable energy and increase energy efficiency for everyone. The community battery project is actually very much a collaboration and a partnership. And we're very grateful to be able to partner with the City of Yarra, the Australian National University's Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program, the network provider, City Power, and our pilot project for the community battery is actually funded through the Victorian Government's Neighbourhood Battery Initiative through the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And yeah, it's a fantastic group of partners. The folks at ANU are very much the country leaders in research when it comes to community batteries. So learning a lot from them especially. Before I jump into talking about community batteries, I wanted to actually start the story with some of the problems and challenges that community batteries actually help us to address. And yeah, I always find this quite very useful. Before we start talking about solutions, is that we actually do need to understand what the problems are or what the issues are that we're trying to address first. So the first one that I've wanted to share with you, we call the solar ceiling. So obviously to achieve net zero emissions, we need to lift what we call the solar ceiling. So that's basically a cap on how much solar can actually be installed in the suburbs. And part of that is also a cap on how much extra solar energy can be circulated through the system. And a lot of this is actually caused by an issue called export limiting. That is a combination of It could be a cluster of too much solar in a particular area, or it could also be partly because the infrastructure hasn't been upgraded and hasn't been able to keep up with the rate of solar installations. A community battery, as I'll explain later on, helps us to alleviate some of those constraints. So obviously one of the main impacts of this solar ceiling and this export limiting is that it's a disincentive for additional solar to be installed. It's also a cap on how much energy can be exported to the grid, and therefore how much energy, renewable energy, can be shared. And any energy, or any solar energy in particular, that doesn't get used or doesn't get stored by a battery actually gets wasted. So there's this other issue around solar waste happening. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about the issue of zero exports or export limiting, I wrote a little explainer on the website. The link is under there, and you're welcome to have a further read about sort of the causes and how a battery could potentially help as well. So the solar ceiling is the first concept. The second is what we call a solar window. So our aim here is basically to transfer the sun's energy that's captured during the day, during this solar window, and deploy it at night to offset when power is basically dominated by brown coal, while also at the same time trying to reduce the costs of electricity, because that's peak demand. So on the left here, you can see a donut at 12:30 p.m. on the 21st of October. You can see there it's the majority is brown coal, with about 30% or so produced from rooftop solar, and this is in Victoria. And on exactly the same day, but just a few hours later in the evening at 6:30 p.m, you can see here all of a sudden brown coal is dominating the energy mix. So what we want to do is shift this window of high renewable energy content to evening times, because that's when most people are using energy. And why is that significant? Well, because unfortunately at the moment when people are using the most amount of energy, that's unfortunately when the grid is made up of a lot of brown coal and not as much renewable energy as we would hope. So how do we lift the solar ceiling, or how can we even get rid of it altogether? And how do we shift this solar window? Well, the answer is community batteries. We also like to refer to them as solar sponges. So I know some of you may be very familiar with community batteries and others maybe not as much. So I will just give a quick overview of our definition of a community battery. So first of all, you can think of a community battery like a giant power bank or a giant energy sponge, and it helps us to store excess energy and then to deploy that when it's needed the most, usually in the evenings. In terms of size of community battery, you can look at anything between sort of a wardrobe or a fridge up to about the size of a shipping container. And they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and it really does depend on the use case. A community battery is one that is actually connected to a grid, and it's suited for a neighborhood setting. Our definition as well of a community battery is one that really should be benefiting the community, including those who may be renting and those who perhaps don't have solar on their homes. Not to confuse you, but there are other ways to refer to these types of batteries, such as neighborhood scale batteries or mid-scale batteries. They don't imply what we mean when we say community battery, because we imply that a community battery needs to benefit the community. Other types of batteries can have network services and other benefits. So community batteries are really popping up all across the country at the moment and generating a lot of interest and a lot of excitement. We do get contacted quite regularly about interest in community batteries. However, community batteries aren't all the same. So you can see here a bunch of different sizes and shapes. Most of these batteries are servicing solar customers only. So that's very different to the model that I'll explain in the upcoming slides. And at the moment, we are very much in this pilot phase. We haven't sort of reached the point as a country yet where we're able to roll out community batteries in networks at scale. But this is exactly why the Victorian Government has funded YEF and our partners, along with, I think it's another 15 other projects. 13 of them are feasibility studies in Victoria. 3 of them are implementation or pilot projects, and ours is one of those. And the aim of that is to fill this knowledge gap that we have at the moment and start to streamline the process of how we can actually start delivering these community batteries. So before I move on, I did want to emphasize we are very much on a frontier at the moment, but it is very exciting to see how much interest there is in this technology, and we are very much only expecting this interest to grow. I wanted to show you this because I thought it was a great map. I stole this one from Dr. Marnie Shaw from ANU, the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program. Thanks, Marnie. This map shows the diversity of some of the key community battery projects across the country at the moment. Most of them, as you can see in green, are still in development, so still coming. The first trials of community batteries occurred in Western Australia. So if you want to learn more about them, there's a report out which talks about the findings from those studies. And there's a couple in New South Wales as well. Wanted to also mention that federal Labor, if elected, will back 400 community batteries across Australia to the tune of about $200 million. So there is interest at local level, there's interest at state level, and there's interest hopefully at federal level as well. And who knows, hopefully with some momentum off the back of COP, maybe we'll go that direction, fingers crossed. So just to summarize here, community batteries can help us in a lot of different ways. These are some of the main ones. They can help us reduce solar waste by removing some of those export limiting conditions. They can allow more solar to be installed, and that also defers network upgrades, which are very expensive for the network. Yeah, no, I won't talk too much about that now. They can reduce losses. So that's a bit more technical. There's transmission losses basically with electricity. So if you can produce and consume in the same local network, you're not experiencing the same percentage of losses. And that's good for everyone. Community batteries can also support the network. So frequency control ancillary services, or FCAS, is one type of service that batteries can actually provide very, very effectively. This type of service helps basically the grid managers maintain the right frequency of the grid, and it's a very valuable service. The battery itself could actually potentially tap that as a revenue source, which can obviously reduce the capital costs and barriers to entry if you're looking for a community battery. Community batteries also hopefully improve energy equity, at least with our model, which is perhaps one of the only community batteries in the country focusing very intently on this equity section. We want our battery to be able to be accessed by anyone on that network, regardless of whether you own solar panels, regardless of if you're renting, if you live in an apartment or a unit or own your own home. We think everyone should have that right to access locally supplied renewable energy. And as a side, it also does help to build trust in the energy sector. Community batteries are a great opportunity to bring people in to start talking about where their energy comes from. Yeah, it's an incredible opportunity. And most of all, community batteries, I hope, and our predictions are that they will actually improve the affordability of energy. So there's a few reasons for this. It does get quite complicated, but there are 3 main ones that I wanted to share with you. As you can see from this pie chart here, we've got orange, which represents the cost of operating, managing poles and wires. And on the left, we've got in purple, the cost of generating electricity. So this is a proportion of a typical power bill. So this is originally from the Australian Energy Market Commission. Now, a community battery actually helps defer or even remove certain costs of upgrading poles and wires, which is significant. And it also reduces the cost of generating electricity because we're enabling more solar, and yeah, it's generation of electricity becomes more and more decentralized if we're relying on rooftop PV rather than remote generation. Another way to look at it is if a battery can shift that solar window from that pie chart that we saw before to the evenings, basically what we're doing is we're actually altering the market in evenings. So we're increasing the local supply of renewable energy, and with demand staying exactly the same, if you raise supply, the price of that electricity should go down. That's a general way to think about it. The third component to this, and as part of our trial, we're actually going to be using a brand new tariff. It's called, well, we refer to it as the local use of system tariff. And basically what this does is it incorporates the cost of only the local use of the network, not the entire network. So essentially the cost of your electricity only being reflected in that local use of system. Yeah, kind of, it might be a little bit confusing without any diagrams and stuff, but basically, instead of being charged to use the entire network, we can actually divide that down into just the local system, reducing the cost of electricity overall. That's it in a nutshell. So how would our model of the community battery work? And I should say we are still in the early stages. We're in pre-installation now. We're just a few weeks away from selecting our battery hardware, but we hope to have something installed next year. So this is what we're working towards. We want a battery that is open to everyone in the neighborhood, as I said before, regardless of whether you have your solar panels or not. The battery would source energy during the day. And when it's cloudy, so, obviously solar isn't as consistent all the time, especially when it's cloudy, the battery could potentially remote charge. And what I mean by that is remote or distant solar farms or wind farms could be tapped into to power that battery if it's cloudy in the local area. So that's one potential option. We don't anticipate there being any additional special costs to participants or customers by signing up to the battery. We're actually forecasting a slight discount. Obviously, this depends on what sort of energy contract you're on, but it makes no sense to switch to a battery if you're going to be paying more. In terms of feed-in tariffs, that will not change at all. So we're not really touching that. So yeah, we do get that question a bit, but the feed-in tariffs for solar will stay the same. So a little bit more detail, as I mentioned, it will charge during the day. When I say during the day, it's typically before about 3 p.m. After that, that's when you start to enter your shoulder and your peak times. Then when it's discharging, it'll be again in that evening period. One of the main differences for customers who would be on our model of the community battery is that it's very likely they would need to switch to what's called the time of use tariff. So the time of use tariff basically means that the price of electricity is changing throughout the day, and that prices would typically be more expensive when everyone else is trying to consume energy, so the peak demand times, and cheapest during off-peak times, which is usually overnight and sometimes on weekends and that sort of thing. So some of you might be interested maybe in getting a community battery for your own neighborhood. So where would you start? So first, I guess, first step would be to understand and really scope out some potential sites that you think might fit the ideal conditions for a battery, or start to look at sites that may be likely to have these conditions in the near future. So looking at areas where solar might be just the rate of solar increase is happening very quickly. Second, you might also want to consider how you might finance a battery and resource the installation, the management of the battery, etc. And think about what stakeholders to involve from the beginning. These might include local council, community members, and ideally, probably someone with or a group with some technical knowledge, because they can get a little bit complex. Now, in terms of conditions, this is a general list, but what you want to be looking for is a solar cluster along a specific part of the network. So lots of solar on the same part of that, what's called a subnetwork. And basically that gives you a better chance at supplying the battery with locally sourced renewable power. The second part that you might look for is a network constraint. This can be a bit tricky to discover, to be honest. You can basically, when you apply to have solar installed to the network will tell you whether or not you're able to export solar or not. If you're not able to, that means you're likely to be in a network constrained area. I suppose with us, we're very lucky, obviously, to be working very closely with City Power, and through them, we're able to get more information about whereabouts in the city of Yarra, that's where our first battery is going, are the areas of most constraints. And then we can overlay that with solar clusters. Another very, very important part is finding appropriate land and making sure that you have appropriate land rights. Note that community batteries will make noise, and we're talking probably in the ballpark of about 60 decibels and upwards, maybe to 90 decibels, Don't quote me on that. And that's probably with minimal noise treatment as well. 60 decibels, you're looking at a probably equivalent sound of about a dishwasher if you're standing 1 meter away. But you can treat a battery to reduce and minimize noise impacts, but that's obviously going to have ramifications in terms of where you place it and finding appropriate land. Great to have community interest and support. That's actually fundamental. You're not going to get past planning processes and get council support unless the community is backing this. Preferably councils with strong climate action, that would be fantastic as well. Having a council partner on board for community batteries, very important, particularly with the planning processes, but also if you're looking to place a battery on public land, that's also quite important. The last thing I would just say as well is just to think about how you might finance battery and how you might sort of resource those technical components as well. Just for, because some of you might be wondering, a community battery could cost in a range of, depending on its size, between maybe $300,000 and upwards, up to several $100,000. That's the kind of ballpark that you'd be looking at in terms of what you need to finance. I'm going to zip through this one, but this is a fantastic little slide that Chris Wallen, the Community Battery Project Manager, came up with. And this just shows our journey of what we've had to go through so far. There's been an immense amount of work to get where we are today, but we're hoping that we're really breaking that ground for other groups like DCAN and other communities and other councils like Darebin, if they're interested in following the same path that we have to get a community battery too. So the first step is to contact your DNSP and start to build that relationship. You need basically permission to connect this type of asset to their network, and having them on board is critical for helping identify areas of constraints and that sort of thing. You also want to be talking with your council, as I mentioned before, for planning processes. Two aspects we sort of come together, and this is still in development for us, but we thought about it from the very beginning, is the business model and the ownership model. So the business model is really when you start thinking about, I guess, links to how you finance, and also how you charge for the battery and how the battery itself may gain revenue and to offset some of those upfront costs and all that sort of stuff. The ownership model we've thought about, but it's still in progress. We're looking at something which could potentially be community owned, but thinking about that from the very start is very important. That's where we would put that in our journey. Next is you'd be thinking about doing a feasibility study and then looking at your financing options as well. YEF is actually, so Chris, our colleague, is currently developing a capability to help groups with this service, because it's not really something which exists in a very affordable way at the moment. So that's something which is in development and that we're hoping to be able to roll out through the Metro Community Power Hub as well in coming months. That's, yeah, to be confirmed. The software is a big package. It's a big part of this project. And that's why we've brought the experts from the Australian National University on board. We're actually hoping to develop software that would be open source so that we can share that with other people who want to develop a community battery and take advantage of that software. Needless to say, software is an essential component to the battery. It will tell the battery when to discharge and when not to discharge and when to charge, and also how to integrate with market services. Council planning, yeah, so it depends on your area as well, obviously, and your council and what overlays you might be under. The City of Yarra has quite a lot of heritage overlay, which is one of the triggers for our planning application that we have to abide by. Community engagement, which is what I'm leading, essential, and site selection. As I mentioned before, you're looking at those criteria that I had on the previous slide, looking at overlaying clusters of solar with constraints and looking at appropriate land areas with the appropriate land rights. After that, you'd probably be needing to start thinking about your tariff structure. As I mentioned before, we're looking at a brand new local use of system tariff. The retailers, we're actually in the process now as well of selecting which retailers, electricity retailers will come on board. So basically, to sign up to the battery, you just have to go through one of the retailers that's part of the battery. It's not complicated. It's kind of the same as what you would do now. And we were aiming to provide options for several retailers that customers and participants can potentially choose from. The aggregator is a separate thing, and I won't go into that in great detail, but that's basically bringing on a retailer to help with those aggregation services and allowing the battery to operate, integrate with the market. And the battery system itself, we are very close to selecting our hardware. This has been many weeks of hard work and conversations. There are a lot of, I suppose, elements going to selecting the right battery system. And again, this is something that we hope to be able to share with everyone once we've sort of gotten through this part of the woods, because that's why we're in the pilot stage, because these things aren't easy. But once we sort of figure out how they work, then we hope to really be able to share that with you. The connection and the design of the battery itself, and then pushing it to delivery, installation, and then going live. So yeah, those final stages of installation require assistance from the network and some very specialist technical expertise there. Stepping back though, I just wanted to talk about how we're situating our project and our pilot and the MCPH within this bigger picture. So we actually have a vision for a network of batteries, not just one battery. When we talk about getting to net zero, when we talk about transformative changes to the energy system, when we talk about finding exponential solutions, not incremental solutions, we really do mean it. And this is what we are pursuing. The Yarra Energy Foundation signed a memorandum of understanding with the City Power network in January this year to pursue a network of hundreds of batteries across City Power. So I won't go into too much detail, but that is the broader vision that we are pursuing. I know it's really ambitious, but the pilot project is very much the entry point and the gateway to understanding how we might be able to power our entire cities with renewable energy in the future. I won't go into a lot of detail here on the business model, but just to clarify, because I know some of you might be wondering, the way we can start to make this possible for other groups is by having a business model that allows the battery to basically self-fund itself, or be attractive enough to external investors or green investors to provide the capital needed to get going. So as I mentioned before, community battery unit itself, it's quite expensive. And then when you add in all the other costs, it can definitely add up. But a community battery can actually gain revenue by through the subscriptions. So by supplying energy and then charging. It can also trade on the electricity market. So in what's called arbitrage, and that's buying electricity when it's cheap and selling it when it's high. That revenue obviously goes in to subsidize the cost of the battery. We also have network support. So there are certain services which a battery is very good at, which it can be paid for. And by being paid by supplying the network with these services, again, it can reduce the cost or help to create a viable financial or business model. And yeah, hopefully we're aiming to crack the nut of the first community battery that will be commercially viable. This hasn't been done before. The earliest community battery trial studies, as I mentioned, from Western Australia, concluded that it was not financially viable, but they started back in 2016, I think it was. So a lot of things have changed since then, including falling prices of battery storage technology. I'll just end by saying, if you'd like to learn more, we've tried to upload as much information as possible to the website. There's a lot of FAQs on there too. And yeah, I look forward to hearing some questions. And if you have any technical questions that we can't answer tonight about batteries, very happy to forward them on to our project manager, who's very much the engineer and specialist behind the project. So with that, I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Peter, as well. I think it's been a fascinating presentations from both of you, which I think, among other things, they really teach us how complicated the energy system is, and how important the pilot projects like yours with the community battery are. The idea of solar sponges is extremely attractive, but it clearly is also a very complex process getting there. So it's great that people like you are blazing the way. And I know Darebin Council is also working with Village Power within Darebin on another pilot project in Alphington. So it's been really fascinating, and I know there are a number of questions, and I'm sure other people have got ones they want to ask live. So Lisa, I'll hand over to you to handle the question and answer now.
Thank you, Anne. That's great. And thank you to Pete and Tim. It's always so interesting, even though I work with them both. Every time I listen to them speak, I learn something new. So I found that fascinating as well. Now, we've had a few questions come through, and I think that perhaps we should start with Tim. If you could talk a little bit about some of the physical aspects of the battery. We had a question from Anne, actually, which I think is really interesting, around how close together do battery customers or subscribers or participants need to be in physical terms to the battery?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I'd prepared a map or something of that. So if you want to Google Ausgrid in New South Wales, they're running a community battery trial right now, and they've actually installed their battery, and you can see a really nice map. I think they've actually got two of the outline of the suburb and which houses in that catchment actually connect to the battery. You're typically at this scale, you're looking at about up to maybe 200 households. Which households or which properties can actually be connected to the battery is dictated by which part of the network that they're connected to. So that's not something that we can change. That's something which is fixed and part of the network. And we refer to that as the subnetwork. So it's basically your local electricity network, and you and probably another couple of hundred folks are on the same network. In terms of physical proximity, yeah, I suppose you're thinking something within a radius of 500 meters or so. That's a kind of a really rough, that's a rough kind of distance, because it depends on the shape of the subnetwork and where you're located and all that sort of thing, and all that sort of thing. But that it's quite localized, in short. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And leading on from that, Linda had a question around what sort of physical site do batteries need? What are the specifications that you have to look for when you're choosing a site?
Yeah, good question. And Pete, feel free to jump in as well. But I don't know, it sort of depends on the size of the battery. So there's a battery, for example, going in Port Phillip. Sorry, not Port Phillip, Phillip Island, sorry. They're funded also through the Neighbourhood Battery Initiative. And their battery is going to be massive, I think 5 megawatts or something. So it's considerably larger than the one we're looking at. That's obviously going to have different criteria and conditions for placement than ours. For ours, the footprint of the battery itself is probably about the size of a large 4-wheel drive. And we'd also need additional space around that for potentially like a screen or screening, or any noise treatment or visual treatment that we have to do. It's not a massive footprint, but yeah, you need sort of a big car park at least for the sort of battery that we're looking at. Pete, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I was just going to say it does present challenges in that respect. And some of the areas that are easier to install a battery of this size are located in substations that are already connected to the city power grid. Knowing that they have the land, own the land, it's a lot easier. At the same time, you could be looking at schools, for example. That's an area that's easier to put in. I think Kate mentioned, well, wasn't along these lines, but heritage overlay does have an influence of where you can put a battery if it's in a council zoned area. You do have to factor that in, but you can get creative. So, for example, I'm working with an apartment block at the moment in North Melbourne, looking at EV infrastructure charging, looking at solar, looking at hot water heat pumps, looking at the whole gamut and the whole array of what you can do. But a community battery of the size, and Tim, you say a large four-wheel drive, I always say a small SUV, it's around that size. But basically that could go into a community, an apartment block. And that in itself is sort of a microgrid. That is a community battery example of a microgrid for the apartment block. Again, it depends how many units are in that apartment block. But these are all options, and we can't do any of these things without doing the work that Tim and the battery team have done this far. So there are a lot of applications for this battery, and putting them where we put them really does depend where there's a problem in the grid. And I think that's a really important point, because there's a lot of goodwill with community batteries. However, a lot of the batteries that some DNSPs might be putting in is really just to help their infrastructure. So it's a really important point to there's a distinction between a community battery and a battery that's going in just to aid the delivery of energy on the grid instead of upgrading a transformer.
Tim, I've heard you speak before too, and Pete as well, about the potential that there is for community batteries to be a sort of celebrated part of a local neighbourhood as well, that it can be something that the community is really proud of and wants to showcase. So I would just add that as a little postscript perhaps to that comment. The next question is also probably for you, Tim, but Pete, please jump in as well. And this is from Jeremy around tariffs, which is a really interesting aspect of this whole discussion. So Jeremy was keen to hear a little bit more about local use of services tariffs, and perhaps we need a little bit of a background for those in the audience who are not familiar with that concept, and just how those tariffs relate to the community battery idea.
Yes, good question. And I'm going to be upfront. I don't know the full depth of the technical details about how the LUOS, the local use of system tariff, basically interfaces with the retailers and then the costs to the customers. Pete, you feel free to jump in if you know those details. But basically, from my understanding, a local use of system tariff reflects the cost of the use of just the local system. So what happens when you introduce a community battery? You actually change basically the little ecosystem that you've got from where energy is generated and where energy is consumed. So a community battery that discharges electricity, we call that generating as well. And hopefully most of that energy that it's generating is actually being sourced from local routes. So there's this kind of like local system there. If you don't have that, you actually get charged, I guess, like a full network worth of cost. So what we're trying to do is have a fairer tariff, which reflects just the cost of that local system. Yeah, Pete?
Yeah. So what's built up into your cent per kilowatt hour charge, there's quite a number of small fees within that charge of cent per kilowatt hour. And some of the retailers that you might see at the moment where you buy in bulk, you buy like 2,000 kilowatts for a month or something like that. They're hedging their bets in terms of what type of energy is being supplied on the market at any one time. So the change of electricity changes regularly on the energy spot market price, which is really complicated and convoluted. Where we can make inroads in that cost is on the local network, which is what Tim was just talking about. So with a community battery, we eliminate that cost, not only because we're putting in a community battery, but also because we're demanding that of the retailer when we negotiate with retailers of them joining in this community battery initiative. So there's a twofold thing. One, technically, they shouldn't be charging their local charge because we put a community battery in. So you shouldn't have to be charged for that. And secondly, we have the negotiating power to do so. There's also DUOS, LUOS and DUOS. It's like Huey, Dewey and Louie. DUOS is the distributor, so the whole of network charge. We can't minimize that, unfortunately, because at the end of the day, if we can't export enough from the solar that's on the rooftop into the community battery, that'll come from the wider network. So that's your Hazelwoods, that's your wind farm in Hepburn. That's all the pools of supply of energy coming onto the grid at any one time.
Fantastic, thank you. A quick follow-up question from Linda, just while we're talking about physical siting of batteries. Tim, public or private land, are they both possible options?
Yeah, for sure. And I think Pete's actually been speaking with maybe even some school opportunities for community batteries. The main consideration there really is land rights. Is that land use going to change? And is there a rent that needs to be built into the business model? So in our case, we're lucky enough to have a site that we're proposing for city power owned land, which means we wouldn't be factoring in an ongoing rent into the operating costs of the battery. But if it's private land, it might be a different story. Again, with council, it could be something else as well. But Pete, you've got some interesting case studies, potentially for schools as well.
Yeah, I think schools are a really good opportunity. At the same time, some schools in the urban areas are short of space. So do you want to really put a battery in there when they should be playing, I guess. I don't really know, but there is opportunity there. But I think it all comes back to, and this is kind of what sweetens the deal for a distributor, is where there's an infrastructure need. At the end of the day, as much as we can do from a grassroots level, and we're doing a heck of a lot, they're going to prioritize where community batteries go. And with schools, particularly if they have solar, there's probably a huge need for a community battery coming off that feeder meter, which supplies the energy to and fro on that feeder meter. So if the school's in that area and has the space to do so, it's a really good location. Same with apartments. So we can actually get quite creative in the location. What that actually means in practicality is just a lot of conversations between ourselves, community and community engagement, of which Tim's done a huge amount of work with the North Fitzroy community, and whoever is in the local area where community battery might go. So that community engagement piece is not to be overlooked. It's a really important part of gaining support and also putting pressure on the likes of the City Power or retailers to listen to what we're trying to achieve. So I think that's not to sugarcoat how important that is, but it is really important. Thanks, Pete.
And yes, I mean, at the heart of the Metro Community Power Hub is that commitment to community engagement and community voices, isn't it? So that's that's a really good point. Thank you for raising that. Yeah. That leads into another question, this time from Councillor Tom Hannon, which is coming at this issue from perhaps another important angle. Is there anywhere that wouldn't be suitable for a community battery? Wondering if there may be future equity issues between areas that have community batteries and those that don't. And equity is something you've talked about, Pete, and I know that's very close to your heart.
Is that directed? I guess it's directed me, Lisa. I think it goes back to Tim's point where if to engage or participate in the community battery that we're attempting to launch with the pilot, you don't have to have solar to participate in that battery. Now, in Yarra alone, there's probably 300 sites that require a community battery. And across those 300 sites, there's an issue with the grid. There's a gap in the grid. There's high voltage in that grid. 300 sites is a lot to cover in what is generally, not a large land space of Yarra. And Darebin, it's a lot larger. But those issues of the grid still exist. So one of the great things that we've been able to achieve over the past 18 months is our formal relationship with City Power, so much so that they actually provide us information where those grid issues lie. Prior to that, they were kind of like Fort Knox, and they weren't alone. And City Power have been brilliant since we started our working relationship with them over the past 18 months. Prior to that, always very difficult to understand what the energy mix is, how it looks like on the grid in terms of the voltage and the supply of excess solar. But they're looking for these solutions too. So in terms of equity, it really boils down to one community battery in one area doesn't mean we can't put one in another area. We just have to prove that the business case works, for one. And then secondly, the idea of drawing power from the community battery will be at a cheaper rate than it would be at an off-peak or on-peak fee. So you still got to pay for the electricity stored in that community battery, but the idea is that it'll be cheaper than what you're paying today. So in terms of equity, that is certainly inbuilt in what we're trying to achieve with our community battery rollout. I think one of the things with equity that we have to consider as well is electric vehicle charging stations and EV infrastructure. So if Coles and Safeway start putting EV infrastructure in, charging infrastructure at their car parks, for example, and they can charge whatever they want. But if it's publicly owned or community owned, we would charge a fair and equitable rate. That's important because EVs are going to be really out of reach for a lot of people, and they will be out of reach if you can't charge it at a fair and competitive rate. So we're also looking into that. The reason why I bring it up, I've just started a PhD in it, and it's really drawn my attraction to equity in this space, particularly over the next 5 to 10 years. But yeah, Councillor Tom Hannon, it's certainly something that we're very conscious of and building into the business plan, I suppose. And it also ties into, sorry, Lisa, I know we're going to tie, I could keep talking, but virtual energy networks are a really important part and piece of this. Virtual energy networks, just very quickly and very simply, If you have a whole bunch of solar that you're not using and you're exporting it back onto the grid, that virtual energy network can connect with someone who has on a bung energy plan, for example, and you can do a one-on-one negotiation of how much you can charge that person to accept that energy. And community batteries plays a really good role in that. If we have 300 community batteries and we have a ton of stored energy, we can supply that at a fair and reasonable rate.
Great. Thanks, Pete. The environmental burden of batteries has attracted a couple of comments from people. What can you tell us, Tim and Pete, about the developments or the anticipated developments in low environmental burden batteries and for batteries at end of life?
Yeah, that's a great question. This actually came up last night. We had a community engagement session as well. So the battery hardware that we're looking at would have, I'm told, up to 95% recyclable material, which is very impressive. About 5% of that apparently is oxidized or something, so it's not suitable to be reused. But the life cycle of the battery is a very high priority for the team that are undertaking the selection of the hardware. So that's in terms of, yeah, what components, physical components of the battery can be recycled or reused. So 95%, very impressive actually. In terms of other embodied, I guess, environmental costs, so embodied carbon and such, I'm not aware, aside from maybe one local Yarra-based battery manufacturer. Technology like this is made up of components from around the world. It's kind of, you know, that globalized supply chain kind of thing. So it's, from my understanding, from what I've heard, it's actually very difficult to say this battery was, you know, sourced and manufactured fully within Australia or, you know, a particular region. They are quite complex pieces of equipment. And yeah, they do unfortunately draw on these global supply chains. So therefore they will have a carbon footprint that reflects that. And Pete, I don't know if you have any more information about the different types of chemistries with batteries and how that might affect their ability to be recycled, maybe?
What I will say is there's increasing pressure on battery companies as well as solar companies, manufacturing companies, for an end-of-life framework or plan. And I do know that Reclaim, I think it's just Reclaim PV is the name of it in South Australia, which were funded by the University of South Australia for, I think, 3 years ago, to recycle solar product properly. And that will extend at some point to batteries as well. One of the best things I think, again, about the Metro Community Power Hub is we can discuss these ideas where we can't be politically affiliated. We can't have any political persuasions. However, we can talk about ideas nonetheless. And with the groups that we have, DCAN, YCAN, GCAN, PCAN, all the cans, you know, that can put a lot of pressure on state or federal government to change those policies or improve those policies. And as a collective, we've got a larger voice and a larger leverage point than we would working independently or in silos. So I share your concerns, but I also think that if we were just to maintain status quo, we wouldn't improve of what we're doing right now. So those sorts of things are being embedded in that global supply chain, in the manufacturing process, in the supply process. So yeah, I can't give you a solid answer, but I can give you solutions to potential problems and problems that exist today.
Thanks, Pete. I'm conscious of the time, so I think we'll be able to fit in 2 more questions if everyone is happy with that. Tim, this is a question from Julie. Do community batteries produce a lot of noise or heat or anything that needs to be considered when we're thinking about, you know, vulnerable local populations like children?
Yeah, so on the noise front, I mentioned very quickly before, they do make noise, and they primarily make noise when they're charging or discharging. They also have noise because a battery unit is, I think all of them are likely to have air conditioning units as well to maintain safe temperatures. So in terms of what that's comparable to, one of the battery manufacturers that quoted to us said that it was about 60 decibels at 1 meter from the battery, and that's a battery with sound insulation on the walls, and that's equivalent to about a dishwasher or perhaps a crowd at a cafe or something. So some other batteries, from what I've seen in the spec, can go up to a bit higher, so maybe 70 or 80 decibels, but depends on the type of battery and the inverter and other technology as part of that battery in the air conditioning unit. But there are things you can do to minimize that noise. And that's actually one of the really major focuses for us, especially because we're looking at rolling out batteries in inner urban areas. It's a very different story if you're looking at putting batteries out in rural regional areas where you have a bit more of a buffer and land size. The question on, so the first one was noise and the second one was on, sorry, I've just blanked.
Was heat.
Heat.
No, that's right,
yes.
on heat, yeah.
Yeah, so look, I'm not an engineer, but the battery packs will generate heat, and they will, like I said before, come with an air conditioning unit to help maintain optimal temperatures for those battery units to continue operating effectively and efficiently. But it's not going to be something that would impact the local environment around, at least not that I'm aware of. Again, caveating, I'm not an engineer. Maybe that will depend on the size of your unit. If you're looking at a giant shipping container, maybe it's a completely different story. But in the project that we're working on, it's unlikely to be an issue at all. It's more about maintaining a temperature parameter for the battery modules themselves to make sure that they can continue to operate efficiently, to my knowledge. Hope that answers the question.
And are those the two chief factors that you would see in terms of the impact on the local area? Because I noticed that Julie asked about, whether there are any concerns about putting it near schools or that sort of thing.
Sure. No, look, the only other things that come to mind are the visual impact and impact to neighbourhood character. That's definitely something which you have to consider when putting your planning applications in. And the other thing is related to that is basically graffiti. So the concerns about security. I know some people that we've spoken to are a bit worried that if we put in a battery, it'll just be a magnet for tags and such. We're also, thinking about engaging local artists to potentially come and make the battery, an even nicer place to be around. So there are these types of options, but it is very much case by case.
Great, thank you. The other question was from Matt, but I see that Pete has addressed that in the comments. So maybe I'll take the last question, is one from Scott around whether the cost of batteries is predicted to trend downwards.
Yeah, good question. And I think Pete will actually have a better idea on household batteries. But in terms of community batteries and battery storage in general, yes, costs are falling and technology is improving. So the energy density, so the amount of stored energy you can pack into a square meter is improving year on year on year. My understanding, I was looking at that information not too long ago. It's rapid, basically. There's new technologies coming out all the time. We're really expecting to be able to compact more and more storage into smaller and smaller spaces. Every year, almost every month, there's like new news about new technologies and that sort of thing. It's a very, very hot market. So yeah, and I haven't really been around the energy space for lots and lots of years, so I couldn't comment on trends that I've observed. But Pete, any comments on like maybe the affordability of like household batteries? Is that sort of projected to become more reasonably affordable in the future?
Oh, look, they've been saying that for quite some time, that the prices will come down, and they sort of haven't. And solar certainly has, but I would argue from a conserving of resources perspective, I'm more leaning towards a community battery solution than having your own community battery, your own personal battery yourself. And I think one of the, I guess, more appealing or encouraging signs is that some of the largest car manufacturers in the world are disposing of their traditional engine combustion engines and are moving towards fuel cells or electric vehicles. So the storage in the if they were to do that, the price of EVs will come down, and that's probably a better prospect than the price of batteries coming down for personal use in a faster way. So yeah, I'm probably leaning towards the prospect that you can use the storage in an electric vehicle for your own personal use, rather than getting your own personal battery, which, you know, heaps of embedded carbon resources involved in doing that, and community batteries as well.
Great. It's 7:29. I know that we could talk very easily for much longer because it's such an exciting field. But thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you Pete and Tim for being so generous with your knowledge. And Anne, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks from me, and I think from all of us, Pete and Tim, for a really engaging presentations. And thank you to everybody who's online. It's been fantastic questions coming in, really engaged crowd here, and that's really good. I think we could continue talking about this for a long time. I'm sure we've ended up the day having a much better idea of what the transition to net zero means for us within our own households in terms of going all electric, and the opportunities that the Metro Community Power Hub offers for help in both understanding that and getting prepared for that, and actually putting it in place, whether it's solar or split systems or whatever. And we also have much clearer understanding, I think, of what's involved with community batteries, and it's going to be very exciting to see how these things develop. So my thanks to everybody. Do look up the Metro Community Power Hub website to find out more. And for anybody who's not a member of DCAN and would like to join us in DCAN, please do get in touch with us. We'd love to have you joining us too.
Join DCAN.
Okay, well, thanks everybody, and good night. And we didn't, at least here where we are, that big thunderstorm didn't eventuate, and we didn't get covered. So that was good too. Thanks everybody.
Thanks a lot, Anne. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.